voters. And while the Supreme Court ruled in June that the Trump administration could not include a citizenship question on the 2020 census, President Trump, in an executive order issued the next month, directed all government agencies to share information requested by the Department of Commerce to the maximum extent permissible under law, which is basically saying just to follow the existing legislation. Yet, despite the fears that these facts raise, we know now how imperative it is for every person living in the Bronx to be counted in the U.S. Census. And that's because there's so much at stake. Millions of dollars in federal funding for some of the Bronx's most vital and basic resources, and the number of congressional districts, assembly districts in the state assembly, and Senate districts in the state Senate, and even city council in New York State is determined by the population numbers, an important factor for many reasons, but especially when it comes to elections. I don't think I need to remind anyone in this room that next year is an important one. It would make sense for the residents of the Bronx, many of whom belong to communities who are considered hard to count, to be wary of participating in the census. But that's why we're here this evening, to dispel fears with facts with a panel of civil rights advocates and activists. In fact, 2 out of 3 of our panel were born right here in the Bronx, so we know we're in good hands. Before I introduce our panel, just a few housekeeping notes. Tonight's event is part of Lehman College's Make the Bronx Count campaign. This is actually the second in a series of events we are holding to educate and inform not only Lehman College community, but the broader Bronx community of the importance of participating in the 2020 census. We'll be hosting several additional events in the new year, including teach-ins, census teach-ins that are scheduled for February 5th and 6th, with a special celebration on April 1, Census Day. So please check lehman.edu for details. This event is being live streamed and recorded, so say hello to all of you watching via Facebook or Lehman's website, and thank you for joining us. Also, we'll be dedicating the last 10 minutes of our conversation this evening to questions and answers. You'll be receiving a note card that will be collected and have your questions, so try to have your questions ready to write down on a note card. And finally, please, if you haven't already, silence your cell phones. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guests this evening. S.A. Olumhense is a reporter covering the Bronx for the city, a really great news website. Before joining the city team, she was a reporter at the Chicago Tribune and at the Investigative Fund. Originally from the Bronx, she's a graduate of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. S.A. will be moderating this evening's discussion. Wennie Chin is the Senior Manager of Civic Engagement at the New York Immigration Coaltion. She oversees the organization's work in civic participation, electoral reform, and good government practices. Prior to joining the New York Immigration Coalition, Wennie was a community organizer at the MinKwon Center for Community Action, working with Asian American youth. Wennie previously managed 2 state Senate races in Queens and was formerly on the board of OCA-NY Advocates, chairing their Civil Rights Committee. Perry Grossman is a senior staff attorney in the Voting Rights Project at the New York Civil Liberties Union, where he focuses on litigation advocacy efforts concerning voting rights and election law issues. At NYCLU, Perry's cases included New York Immigration Coalition versus U.S. Department of Commerce, the successful challenge to the Trump administration's efforts to put a citizenship question on the 2020 census, and League of Women Voters versus New York State Board of Elections, a state constitutional challenge to a statute requiring voters to register at least 25 days in advance of an election, and NAACP versus East Ramapo Central School District, a racial vote dilution case brought under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So with these great panelists and moderator, S.A., take it away.
Thank you, Leland. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out despite the rain today. I know it couldn't have made it easy. As Leland mentioned, I'm joined by 2 fantastic experts on all things census, and we are here to try to help folks make some sense of the census. So I just want to jump right into it. I never like to assume that anyone knows everything about what we are talking about. So Perry, Wennie, talk to us about the census in the plainest possible terms. What is it?
Yes, so for me, I just want to start by introducing the York Immigration Coalition and what is our role in the census. So we came together, so the New York Immigration Coalition is a coalition of organizations across New York State working to improve immigrant policy and advocate for better implementation of policies to improve the lives of the immigrant communities across our states. We came together in 2018 and created what is called New York Counts 2020, which is now the largest statewide coalition of organizations working to ensure that there's a fair and accurate count of the census. So what exactly is the census? And if there's any 90s rap fans here, I like to attribute Lil Kim, DMX, and the Lox. They came together and made this song that's now my census anthem called Money, Power, Respect. And I think those three words really sum what the census means for me. Money. It impacts how our federal dollars are allocated to each state. Some research will tell you it's 800 billion. Some research will tell you that it's 600 billion. The number goes up as high as $1.5 trillion is what the federal government allocates based on census data. And here in New York, we estimate about $73 billion in 2017. So it's a huge sum of money. And when we talk about the census and getting a fair count, we're not saying New York needs more of that funding. We're asking that New York gets its fair share of that federal pie. When it comes to power, I think Elin had touched on it, that we are entering an age of huge civic engagement. The census data not just informs the money allocation, but also informs how district lines are drawn. Now, we all know the Senate, every state gets 2 seats. But in the House of Representatives, we have 435 assembly districts. And each seat that is allocated to the state is based on that state's population. New York has been on trend and has been continually losing seats in the House of Representatives. And I think this is a good connection to 2020 because what the House of Representatives and the seats is equated in the electoral college. So when we say that we are voting for the president, we vote for the electoral college's votes. And if New York loses seats in the House of Representatives, we also lose seats in the electoral college. That means our vote is weighted less in the presidential elections. And then the last part, and I think the most important part for me, is respect. I work with the immigrant population. It is a population that many people often describe as the invisible populations. The communities are in the shadows. They're not heard. They're not seen. They work hard, and then we don't see them. And the census is one of those things where we can really take, reclaim, and make ourselves heard, make ourselves seen and felt. So, and really, the census is not just about government and understanding the data. A lot of organizations and a lot of institutions use census data. When I was in school, I was writing my thesis, I would always use census-based data. A lot of researchers, foundations use this to draw conclusions about communities. And when you're not part of their conclusions, when they don't see you in those numbers, their decisions and conclusions won't be inclusive of your needs. And that's really how I understand the census. Thank you, DMX and Lil Kim.
I think Wendy really covered it. It really is about allocation of federal resources, the apportionment of congressional seats between states. The census touches every single person in this room here. Maybe you send your child to a public school who gets Title I funds. Maybe you're a Medicaid recipient. Maybe you drive on roads, right? That happens sometimes. Maybe you take public transportation, right? The census touches so many different federal programs that it is virtually impossible to point to a single human being and find somebody who the census doesn't touch. So it's also an important product for, when you started to mention foundations and research, businesses use it as well, right? How do we know, where to build our stores? How do we identify the best place to start new bus routes or things like that? So it really does touch everything we do, and getting it right is critically important. And obviously it's something that I use in my everyday for Voting Rights Act enforcement.
Fantastic. And my next question is, of course, about the question, and Elin hinted at it earlier. The Trump administration floated the possibility of introducing a citizenship question to this coming census. And that would have required people to provide or offer information on their citizenship status. Of course, as we know, and folks here may or may not know this, the Supreme Court kind of blocked that earlier this year in June. But I'm interested in finding out from you guys, even though the question has kind of been eviscerated legally, has it had any impact on the way people perceive and receive information about the census, particularly in places like the Bronx?
Yes, absolutely, right? You know, it took a pretty Herculean effort on the part of a huge team at, you know, my organization, the ACLU, our co-counsel Donald and Porter, other law firms around the country, my client over here, Wennie, you know, all working together to get that question off the census and to expose it for the fraud that it really was, right? The administration had the unmitigated temerity to suggest that putting a citizenship question would help us enforce the Voting Rights Act, which is absurd.
But
right?
help us understand that argument. Like, what exactly were they pushing for this for?
So we actually do use another Census Bureau product that's really important for Voting Rights Act enforcement, which is the American Community Survey. So I get calls all the time saying like, hey, I received something from the Census Bureau, it's got a citizenship question on it, I'm freaked out, what do I do? And I'm like, don't worry, that's the American Community Survey. It comes around every year. It asks, you know, dozens of questions. You should answer it completely and accurately. Your data's safe. I know that's something we'll get into in a bit. And you know, the citizenship data that comes through the American Community Survey is important for figuring out, you know, how do we draw districts in a way that respect minority representation. That's a pretty good instrument. We've gotten used to using it. We actually haven't had a citizenship question at all on the census since before the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. And I don't know if you've noticed, but this administration does not particularly care about minorities at all, let alone their voting rights. In fact, I think if they could diminish their voting rights into nothing, they'd be all the happier. So, you know, you can walk through the entire absurdity of their Voting Rights Act rationale, right? Wilbur Ross gets into office and says, you know, immediately, you know, how do we get this on the census? And then actually goes about the process of getting the Department of Justice to request a question that he wants for some purpose that he refuses to state publicly. But before he gets to the Department of Justice, first he stops off to ask the folks at the Executive Office of Immigration Review, and then he goes over to the Department of Homeland Security, which is in charge of immigration stuff. So it became very clear that this was about intimidation, and it's also about something we'll get into later, which is redistricting in a way that actually hurts minorities. So not Voting Rights Act enforcement, but diminishing minority voting strength by undercounting communities of color and immigrant communities.
And you mentioned a keyword. I want to give you an opportunity to chime in here. Intimidation. You know, you mentioned folks, you know, they get the American Community Survey and they call you because they're concerned about, you know, information on their citizenship being shared. How does that fear manifest? You know, you are working with an immigrant population. In what different ways do you see people express their concern about this?
Yes, and I really appreciate that question, but before I get to there, I want to backtrack. So earlier you said that the Supreme Court eviscerated the citizenship question, and I just want to flag for everyone here in the room that the Supreme Court said that the Department of Commerce did not have enough reasons to have a citizenship question on this census. It did not close the door on the possibility of having a citizenship question in the 2030 census. So it's really important that we continue to stay vigilant and we can talk about why a citizenship question on the census is a bad idea. Perry can give you 2-hour or 3-hour lectures on the redistricting impact, but really we have to continue to stay vigilant. 2020 is one victory, but it's a battle and we're still at war. And there's still going to be efforts to hamper voting rights of the minority community. And now when you talk about fear, fear and understanding the question itself, we knew that the damage was done the second news came out that there may be a citizenship question on the census. Because our community, we're not always in front of the newspaper, we're not always in front of the television. We consume news in bits and pieces. And once that information was relayed to our community that there may be a potential chance that the Census Bureau is going to be collecting citizenship data, even if they don't explain what that data is for, there's already a lot of concerns around collection of status. And so what we've been doing is really going into communities and having these small group conversations to rebuild that trust in the census. The census has existed before this administration. The census will continue to exist after this administration, and really helping communities understand that, one, the citizenship question is no longer on the census, but also the bigger conversation is to understand that that topic was raised to instill fear. Whether or not it materializes does not matter. There's fear already built in, and the Bureau knew that. Well, not the Bureau, the administration knew that. And so it's having these small group conversations and also really cultivating a conversation around not just the citizenship question, but understanding what is at risk and how much more there is to gain for a community that's already continually underserved. When you are calling your elected officials and complaining about services you're receiving and you feel like your community is under-resourced, and understanding that by completing the census, you're helping your community by that much is a huge conversation to be had.
Just to chime back in terms of fear, right? People are concerned that this stuff was going to be used for immigration enforcement, that this was going to be used to target people who responded, and we've seen an awful lot of the bad things that go on with ICE, erroneous detentions, raids on people who have no business being part of those kind of immigration enforcement proceedings, and those are the calls we got. And there's a bad history of the census that goes back to the Second World War, when that data was used to intern Japanese Americans. Luckily, since then, we've had confidentiality protections that have been passed that prevent that put stiff criminal penalties on the use of that. But there's still a concern that handing over your data to the government is problematic, and there's always been an undercount of immigrant communities and communities of color. It's worse now because of this administration and everything they've done to terrorize immigrant communities from day one, right? The Muslim ban, right, gets enacted a week into the administration, right? This has been a consistent theme. So this just becomes part of that pattern. And we've all heard the fear, calls to our offices, small group meetings, and that sort of thing. And so rebuilding trust that this administration has really intentionally and directly and effectively damaged, rebuilding that is sort of all of our responsibility.
So I'm sure there's some skeptic somewhere, perhaps not in our lovely audience, but maybe on Facebook or somewhere else, who's like, well, why should people who aren't citizens participate in the census? What's your response to that? Is there even a response you can offer to that?
Well, we can start with the Constitution of the United States, right? The Constitution of the United States says we count all persons living in the United States. It's not all citizens. It's not all eligible voters. It's not all people with lawful status. It is all persons, right? So first, let's start with the constitutional command right there. Second, from a practical perspective, it makes sense to count every person, right? We have a country that exists with citizens, with immigrants of every status, and we want to make sure that political power is apportioned effectively, that our resources are apportioned effectively, so that we're able to have a thriving economy and an effective government and a cohesive, stable society. So ensuring that everybody who lives here is a part of that count, it goes back to what Wennie said. It's in large part about respect for everyone who's here, and making sure that our government is serving all of them effectively.
And I'm going to bring up something called Title 13. Perry, feel free to chime in. I know this is your jam. But Title 13 is a federal piece of legislation that provides protection around census data, and there are pretty strong penalties if anyone reveals Census Bureau data. The Census Bureau is never allowed to share any individual information, any individual responses. The smallest amount of information you can receive is through a census tract, which is still tens of thousands of people. That being said, I will never tell you that, and I put this out there, that Title 13 is a very secure and important piece of legislation that really protects census data, but also understand that I will never say full 100% trust the government. I'm not going to say that to my community, but I tell them, and this is something that really resonates, is if you don't fill out the census because you are fearful of potentially losing or being at risk at something versus a very tangible loss of funding and resources for a community, that's a decision you have to weigh. It's a potential versus something that will happen if New York gets an undercount. And that's something that we have hundreds of years of, well, not hundreds, 200 years of history to support. And I think when I go into my community and I have these conversations, they really understand because, and really helping them understand that the Census Bureau is not allowed to share with law enforcement, not allowed to share with any immigration enforcement, not allowed to share with any other government agency. And the relationship with data is that other agencies can share information with the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau cannot put information back out. That's on an individual level. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's about right. Right, so Title 13 of the U.S. Code is the Census Act. Most of the provisions come from around 1976. There are super stiff penalties for government employees who unlawfully disclose census data, even within the government, right? I think it's 5 years in prison, and I want to say
$250,000.
it might be a $250,000 fine. It might be a $5,000 fine though. But the 5 years in prison is a pretty big deterrent to sharing people's individual information. 5 years in prison is a deterrent to a lot of things. So
but
there's
is that portion of the law, I just want to jump in, is it lacking in any way? I mean, that's a stiff penalty. It sounds like
it's pretty tight. It's never been violated to the best of my knowledge, and I get this question a lot. I would also, it's not the only protection we have though, right? Like, you got to remember that the Census Bureau is largely staffed by career civil servants, right? People and really wonderful data scientists who do their best to make sure we have a complete and accurate count. And the data is most securely in their hands, and there's numerous layers between political appointees and the career civil servants who have the data. There are disclosure avoidance procedures that go on, to make sure that individual level data is not able to get out. There are statistical practices that are enforced throughout the executive branch in order to protect individual data. So there's a lot of layers, and right, as lawyers, we never ever make 100% guarantees. I will not make one here today. But your data is pretty safe in the hands of the regulatory regime that we have. And, as awful as this administration is, as hard as it is to trust them, I think you're in pretty good hands filling out the census and giving that data and encouraging others to do so also. And if it makes you sleep better at night, there's a 5-year statute of limitations on that federal law criminalizing disclosure. So even after the end of the Trump administration, people who unlawfully disclose it could still go to jail.
So we're fortunate enough to be having this conversation tonight in the Bronx, here at Lehman College. The Bronx, according to a 2018 comptroller report, is the fastest growing county in the state of New York. And most of that is driven by immigrants, according to this report. We do know that the Bronx has a lot of populations that are considered hard to count. This question is 2 parts. I'd love to hear from you guys all of the kinds of populations that can be described as hard to count, and what's at stake if there is an undercount. So it's 2 parts, there's a lot here. So take your time tackling it.
I'm going to try to run through the list of hard to count populations, and I want to preface, as an organizer, I don't like to use the term hard to count because that puts the onus on the community that they should be counted. I like to call them at risk of an undercount because it is nothing that a community does that makes them hard to count. They simply exist. And there are factors and circumstantial limitations as to why those communities have historically and currently at risk of being undercounted. The communities that I can list off the top of my head is the immigrant community because of a lot of fears of sharing information. Communities that are very mobile and transient, such as the homeless populations. We have the LGBTQ community. I think, and all of these they're not in silos. These all work in each other. There are a lot of LGBT community actually are also part of the homeless community because they have to leave home for various reasons. We have children. Children is absolutely historically the most undercounted and continually undercounted communities, particularly children who live in different living or family arrangements.
And why might that be? If you could take a second to...
Yeah, so, and I think that the undercount of children is actually a very complex issue. I think when you're a child in an immigrant family, if your parents don't fill out the census, you inherently will be undercounted. If you are a child who have a renter family who's very mobile and don't have access to mailbox or don't frequently check the mail, those children in that household will also be undercounted. Children who may have different living arrangements, maybe with a single parent or in between homes, foster care. So there's a lot of reasons why the children community and population is undercounted. Feel free to chime in, Perry, if you know more. And that's why we're really making an effort to uplift the community, the under 5 population. People just don't know that they have to count their child. I think simply like when you're filling out a form, you're like, oh, it's me and my partner, and then I have an infant, but my infant is only 5 months old, so like I'm gonna leave them off the form. And that's why we're really educating, having these conversations with the community, highlighting certain aspects that hinder their participation in the census. I touched on the renter community. What else is there? The Muslim population, I think, as Perry alluded to, the Muslim ban is huge. After 9/11, I think the Arab American community and the Muslim community really felt like they're sharing information with the government at large is a very dangerous thing. So we really have to work to mitigate those fears and misunderstandings or valid understandings. And what other communities? Any more you can add to it?
I don't know, that was a pretty good list. I mean, we've got a lot of different communities that we've got to do a lot of work on in order to get their full participation in the census. And you know, the Bronx has its work cut out for it because it's so diverse, right? I mean, you and I are Bronx residents, and yeah, that's right. And
Brooklyn represents too.
not tonight. No, I'm just kidding. You know, and my family were immigrants that came to the Bronx. It's been a while, but you know, we're still that way. And because we have so much language diversity, right? If you're going to educate people about the census, you've got to do it in the language they speak at home. We've got, you know, difficult transit situations, as I might have experienced getting over here tonight. You know, the Bronx is a diverse community racially, ethnically, linguistically, and from a national origin perspective, right? And so all of the things that make the Bronx such an exciting and wonderful place to live, and the reason it's the fastest growing community in the United States, not sorry, United States, in Foster County in the state of New York.
I wish though, in the United States.
Well, yes. Although I guess this is probably the last place where housing is affordable in New York City, so maybe that helps. But, and even then, pushing it. But, you know, all those things that make the Bronx great are what make it so challenging. And so we've got to do all that more work in terms of outreach, education, making sure that the census is at the fingertips of everyone who could possibly respond to it, making sure that not just we're doing it, right, and we got to do it ourselves, put the oxygen mask on before you go help everybody else, but then we've got to remind our friends and our neighbors and everybody we know, and then once we're done with that, we got to go find everybody we don't know and tell them to respond. And you know, we've got to be the trusted messengers for our neighbors, you know? So whether you are a West African immigrant who, you know, whose neighbors speak like Igbo or Yoruba, you know, you've got to be there for them to give them information in a way that is credible and understandable. Or, you know, maybe you live in Hunts Point and you've got a lot of organizations that won't necessarily go south of the Bruckner over there. Like, you've got to like go the extra mile to reach out to your friends and neighbors and ask them those questions. Make sure that they know to participate and explain to them how important it is. So, you know, we've got to be our brother's keeper all over this borough, because if we don't look out for each other, who will?
I want to add an addendum to my list. This census is actually the first census that will be done digitally, which is huge for communities that don't have broadband access and communities that just aren't savvy with technology. I think this year, the way you fill out the census, not the census will come to you. in a paper form and you just fill it out and mail it back. This time around, the process looks a little different. You will receive a postcard, or most families will receive a postcard with a hyperlink, with a code. You go on your computer or your cell phone and then you type in that hyperlink and then you type in the code that they provide you, and then you fill out the census. So I think just understanding the digital divide and that there is a very real digital divide. If I tell my grandmother, who's 80 years old, Chinese speaking, living in Brooklyn, to fill out the census via mail, she will have no idea how to do that. Unless her family, like me, go home and do it for her, she will be undercounted. She will not be counted in the 2020 census. So thinking about those populations and really helping to, and so that's something that we are very lucky that New York City has recognized that there's so many layers of difficulty in making sure that New York City and New York State gets our fair count, that the city has done something tremendous. They've poured in mass amounts of investment in making sure that there's funding for organizations who play that role, who have the language capacity, who have the cultural competency to connect with their community and do work like this and go door to door to call their community and remind them to fill out the census, how to fill out the census, and provide digital access if they don't have digital access already.
And you both, go ahead,
I don't know if I can
please.
get, because I missed a part of your question I think is important, right? You asked, like, why is it important here, right? The Bronx is a place where we have a significant amount of poverty, right? And because we are consistently undercounted, not only do we have poverty, but we're not getting our fair share of federal resources, right? We've got a lot of Medicaid recipients here in the Bronx. We got to make sure that we're getting our full complement of Medicaid funds so that we have a healthier population. We got a lot of Title I schools, public schools here in the Bronx. We got to make sure that our schools are adequately funded. We could go through the entire list of federal programs that other communities get the benefit of, and make it an easier place to live, an easier place to get jobs, to be a thriving, healthy family. That's what adequately responding means here. It means putting the Bronx on par with other places instead of a disadvantage in terms of the resources that we get from government in order to build a better community.
Yeah, and this is something that someone had shared with me. On the issue of criminal justice, directly relates to the census. When we talk about over-policing, they look at crime rates. Crime rates are drawn on population data. You draw that line. So understanding which communities are continually over-policed, are claimed to have the highest crime rates, are also the same communities that continue to be undercounted in census.
So there's so much being done, it seems, around the census this year to rally people to learn about it, to participate in it. I mean, if I had like $1 every time I heard the word census over the last several months, I wouldn't be a journalist.
You'll be Michael Bloomberg.
So talk a little bit about the initiatives. What's new this year? In what ways are people rallying the community here in the Bronx and elsewhere in the city to engage them on the census?
Well, one, I want to highlight that Elin said that she is part of the Complete Counts here at Lehman. I think Complete Count committees are huge tools to share information with their community. And Complete Count committees are something that can be done beyond just geography. It could be done through racial groups or however you want to define your complete count. But in New York City particularly, the libraries have tremendously taken on a massive effort in making sure that they are equipped to provide digital access to anyone who wants to come into the library and fill out the census. We talked about that digital divide. The libraries that they're saying, we can fill that role. We have computers, we have digital access already. We are ready to play this role for our communities. A lot of CBOs are part of the New York City has created, first time in New York City created an Office of Census that will be overseeing a really robust community outreach program called NOCs, Neighborhood Organizing Complete Counts. And they will deploy volunteers to go into each census tract, which is a small, few thousand people, well, not small, 1,000 to 10,000 individuals and make sure that every door is knocked on. Because what the census is that it is not just a count of individuals, it is mailed to households. So if you can get a household a door to open and have that conversation and make sure that they are counted, you may be not just counting one person in the household, you'll be counting everyone who's living there. So there's a very robust door knocking program. And individually, CBOs are also undertaking a huge public awareness. For me, I think of the census as 3 parts. You help our communities understand what the census is and then help them build the intention to fill out the census. You then have a conversation to help them understand how to fill out the census because it's digital. Also, I didn't mention, but this year the census can also be filled out by phone. So you can dial into the census's official number and request to fill out the census by phone. And this is particularly helpful for communities that don't have high literacy or don't have the digital access that they can do it online. Sorry, where was I?
You're doing pretty good.
I don't remember what it was.
CBOs.
So really having those conversations, helping them build the intention, understand how to fill out the census, and then actually giving them a reminder of when the census comes around. The census comes around mid-March, and you can fill it out all the way through the end of May. So really taking advantage of that time, that window, and understanding how to fill out the census, what is actually on the census, if they have concerns around the citizenship question, or if they're confusing the census with the American Community Survey. We're really here to help them better understand the tool. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Wennie said. I would make sure that you understand that those knocks that we're talking about, those are trusted messages. That's not the Trump administration knocking at your door, right? Maybe that was an unfortunate name for the program, but the idea is the people you get the information that you trust most are the ones closest to you, the people who you interact with every day, the people who speak your language, who you bump into at the grocery store, like all that kind of thing. So it's really, really important that we be sending trusted messengers around to answer questions, to talk to people, to make sure that they understand that filling out the census is a good idea and not the kind of thing that's going to get them in trouble. And I would also say that filling out the census is in large part an act of resistance. I know that sounds funny. How is participation in the largest government peacetime action an act of resistance? But this administration is trying to stop you from being counted. It doesn't want the Bronx to be counted, right? We got a lot of people they don't like here. And every time we stand up and say, all of us, we're here, we're not going away, and give us the power that we're owed, give us the power on equal footing with other Americans, that is a powerful statement.
Yeah, and out of this conversation, I've seen a lot of creativity in our communities. This past April 1st, we held a huge public awareness campaign, and I had one partner come up to me and said, I posted 50 flyers in my community. I posted them, and I said, where'd you post them? In school? She said, no. I put them in laundromats, in delis, in hair salons, in nail salons, in barbershops, where communities spend their time, where conversations like this can persist, and really meeting our communities where they're at and not asking them to go above and beyond to receive this information. And I think that's tremendous, and that's the power of community organizing, when you have people who know where the community goes and is able to deliver that message.
Yeah, and there's points of entry for everybody to get involved, right? I mean, there are opportunities for every single one of you to come out and help make the census a success, right? You can volunteer with any number of the CBOs that have gotten grants from the city. The city allocated $19 million to go out to community-based organizations all over the 5 boroughs to try and reach those, I'm trying to echo your phrasing, not hard to count, but at risk of being undercounted communities. I have hard to count stuck in my head from all the litigation. So, you can volunteer with the CBOs, but even if you're not volunteering, if you're not spending, 10 hours a week during that census period knocking on doors, every time you talk to somebody about the census, it's going to make a dent, right? One contact on an issue isn't going to turn somebody into a committed participant. You know, it's 2 contacts, it's 10 contacts, it's 15. So maybe you mentioned it to your neighbor once, and another neighbor mentions it to them, and by the time Census Day rolls around, they've heard about the census, you know, 10 times between their friends and neighbors and the city and NYIC and NYCLU, and then they go ahead and do it. So every time you bring it up, every time you talk to somebody about it, it makes a big difference.
So the organizers have some data, and the magic number according to organizing community is 7 times. 7 times the message is repeated is when the message will be remembered. So think of 7 as your magic number. And I like to think of this as like rain on a rock. When 1 drop trickles, it may roll off. But if, like today, if it's raining heavily and it's being pelted by multiple raindrops, that rock will be soaked by the end of the night. And that's really what we want our communities to be. We want to be soaked, oversaturated with census knowledge, and really making sure that everyone in our community can be census gladiators, can be part of the resistance.
And I'm soaking wet, so that makes all the sense in the world to me.
So we touched on this briefly. You both actually surfaced this. For the first time, the census will be conducted in part on the internet. And I want to share some data with you guys. The so-called digital divide, which refers to differences in internet access between communities, is actually very pronounced here in the Bronx. So the Bronx ranks dead last of the 5 boroughs in New York City for high-speed internet access. There are, in fact, many rural counties, several, I should say, here in the state of New York that have higher percentages of households with high-speed internet access than a county, a borough in the city of New York. So for some additional context, just under half of the households in Bronx neighborhoods like Hunts Point, Melrose, Morris Heights, Mount Hope, Belmont, and Fordham South lack broadband internet access, according to a report this year from the city comptroller. So even though the Census Bureau is offering by phone and a written way of participating in the survey, should we be concerned at all about a possibility for undercount because of the pivot to the web? Is there?
So, yes, right? I mean, anytime you've got a population with significantly better access to the primary means of response, we've got to be concerned that we're going to be undercounted, because it's not just that, we want everyone to be counted, but no census in history has ever counted everybody, right? So we're trying to do the best we can. And the problem is, if we have a differential undercount, which is to say that the undercount of communities in the Bronx is worse than the undercount elsewhere, we are going to lose out on resources and political power vis-a-vis those other places. So it's really, really critical, 1, that we're advocating for better broadband access here in the Bronx, but 2, that we're also working harder to ensure that our fellow Bronx residents are using all of the means at their disposal, including going to the public libraries and using the terminals there, using their phones, not just their phones to call in, but also web browsers, right? Because even though we're short on broadband access, people can still use cellular data to open up their web browser and just do it right there. And so not everybody has a laptop at home, but more people have smartphones than ever before. And they don't have to use their own devices. They can use other devices, right? The census is not tagged into your particular phone or laptop or anything like that. You can go use a friend's and neighbors. I just keep coming back to education, outreach, and trusted messengers, because that's what it is. If you've got friends and neighbors who don't necessarily have broadband access, go bring your computer over there. Go bring them over to your house. Let them use your phone. Or tell them, like, hey, by the way, you can go to the public library and do this. So we've got to be looking out for each other to make sure that we're finding all of those means at our disposal. But also let City Hall know that the Bronx needs broadband, and we shouldn't be second to the Adirondacks, or behind the Adirondacks in terms of broadband access.
It's also something, before you jump in here, Wennie, it's also something I think about when it comes to applying for jobs with the Census Bureau. If the application is online and you have a person who doesn't have high-speed internet access, like, that erects a barrier of some sort to them getting that job. And it's something that I think about a lot as a reporter on an online-only news site. It seems like every 4th person I meet I'm explaining what the city is, which is not I won't call it a chore, but it's not something that I mind doing. But I am reminded a lot that the Bronx has this kind of almost wall around it to the outside world. So before you...
So I just jump in really fast. So I just saw today, a colleague sent me that Senator Parker was hosting like a census job fair, right? And I think census jobs pay about $25 an hour, which is, not bad. You've got good reps here in the Bronx. I see them with some frequency. They are really committed to ensuring there's a complete and accurate count. Call them up. Let them know, are you guys going to be doing census job fairs? How can we support that? How can we make sure that a good cross-section of our community is going to be out there as enumerators doing that job so we can trust the people who knock on our door?
Absolutely. Everything Perry said. I mean, Lehman, if Lehman College wants to host a job fair, I totally endorse it. And I think the message, like Perry said, is that it's really outreach and education, but the responsibility does not just lie with me, it does not just lie with Perry or Essay or Elin, but really every person here in this room has an equal and invested responsibility to make sure that their community is counted. I mean, I live in a building with seniors, and I recognize that not everyone, not even just broadband access, may not just have access to the internet, period. So maybe what I want to do is maybe just set up shop on a weekend with my laptop and offer my computer to communities to fill out the census, offer it to my neighbors, or tell them that if you don't feel comfortable using my computer, let me give you the phone number so you can just go home and call this phone number and fill out the census, and really helping them understand that it's a challenge that we have to overcome through structural means, and really demanding that these companies provide high-speed broadband access to communities, but also recognizing that we too have a role to play. That if I am counted, but the rest of my building is not, what does that mean for my entire neighborhood? That means that 90% of the people around me will not be counted, and that resources, when they're thinking about building out things that are important to me, like bike lanes and trains and buses, that we won't be having that conversation because the government doesn't see us as an entity of 100, but really it's the few that fill out the census. So really when I say that everyone needs to be a census gladiator, I really mean it, because it's not one person's job. And the only way that this can work is if we do it together. The census is the one thing that really brings every community and all kinds of interests together. I've seen meetings where we have 10 organizers and landlords in the same space because they recognize how important the census is. I've seen laborers and huge corporations come together around the census, to really understanding that this is not something that someone else needs to do to make sure our communities are counted, but this is something that I need to do to make sure that my community is counted.
And you don't have to set the bar that high, right? I mean, if you go talk to one person about the census, that's better than nothing. I don't want you to feel like in order to do anything valuable, you've got to go get your whole building to sign it up. Don't get me wrong, I would love it if your whole building filled out the census and you guaranteed that. I'd love it if you did your whole neighborhood. But if all you did was knock on your next door neighbor's door, if all you did was talk to the person sitting at the coffee shop next to you, if all you did was call up your mom and make sure your mom fills out the census, that would be sensational.
It's my mom calling me about the census now. My parents are so fired up about it. And they're also the kind of people, this ties into my next question, who have access to the internet but are super skeptical of doing anything online. And we talked about some of the fears around privacy, Title 13. Are there any specific concerns related to the census being on the internet that you guys hear from people? Do people think it's, my parents think any link open from the internet is malware that's gonna blow up their computer. Mom and Dad love you. But yeah, anything to say on that?
The Census Bureau is very aware that because it's online, there are people who because we hear about data breaches and privacy violations all the time. So they're very intentional around building out protections and encryptions of that data, not just the data that you submit, but the metadata that is attached to it. So where you fill out that form, when you fill out that form. All that data is encrypted at the point of submission and at the point of, and it's encrypted again at the point of receipt. Obviously, that is so nerdy. No one's going to understand that. If I try to explain to my mom encryption, she would have no idea what I'm saying. But it's really emphasizing that there's so much to gain by filling out the census and so much that our community has to lose by not participating, and really helping them understand, what does that mean? Well, it means food stamps. Well, it means policing in our community. It may mean transportation, schools. I like to tell people the story of children because no one can hate children. And if you do, then oh my God. But really, when you talk about children, everyone here knows a child. If you don't fill out the census, your community or children around you will be under-resourced in their schools. And I'm not talking about the impacts of 1 year. For the census is taken every 10 years, and so the data collected will be used for that decade. So when you think about 10 years, for a student in school, 10 years is their entire educational lifetime. And that means for that entire generation of children, they will be under-resourced, they will be underfunded, they will have crowded schools, they will not have free school lunches, they will have to compete for public transit cards. And those are the issues that I think resonate with my community. And I continue to emphasize the impact that the census has on daily life and particularly children.
Excellent point. Anything to add?
I mean, as an ACLU lawyer, I feel pretty weird telling people like, oh yeah, like send your data to the government, it's fine. But you know, they really have invested a lot in digital security, and you should feel fairly confident that your data is protected when you transmit it online through their encrypted portal. So go for it.
So last question before we get to these awesome and very detailed questions so far I'm seeing. Thank you guys. What reliable sources of info should folks be following about the census? This can be stuff that's on social media, it can be print news. Like, what do you, when you wake up in the morning with a thirst for census knowledge and information, where do you go?
I mean, I check the city first thing every morning.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
No, there have been a bunch of reporters who I think have done really in-depth, detailed work. The first person I would talk to is and whose stuff I read is Hansi Lo Wang at NPR. He's a dedicated census reporter. There are not a lot of news outlets that have that kind of dedication to a particular thing. I credit NPR for recognizing just what a huge impact the census had in creating a census beat. He's been, following this thing day in and day out. I'll be honest, during trial, when we would get enormous document dumps from the government, I would definitely keep an eye on Hansi's Twitter feed to see what he found, because he would frequently come up with stuff faster than we would, and we're like a team of lawyers poring over documents. So I think you're in good shape with Hansi. I think, on social media, if you're following any of our organizations that were involved in standing up to the citizenship question, NYCLU, ACLU, New York Immigration Coalition, Make the Road, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, which had the Maryland case, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, which had a California case. And frankly, I think the city has been doing a pretty good job committing to putting the resources necessary to get a complete and accurate count. So I think you can actually trust what the city is saying for the most part.
The city of New York. Okay.
Yes. Another thing I'm reluctant as an ACLU lawyer to say is trust the city. But on this limited instance, you can trust the city. Any other thing, check with me first.
Anything?
Yes, to add to that, I think social media is great. I think if you just search Census 2020 as a hashtag, sometimes I use that to filter nice graphics and data points, but also recognizing that there's a digital divide, so not everyone's on social media or Twitter. I didn't start using Twitter until I started this job a year ago, so I'm not a Twitter person. But I do check the Office of Census. New York Immigration Coalition, we have a coalition separate that's specifically around the census work, and it's called NewYorkCounts2020.org. That's a really great place to just find toolkits, things that you can share with your community. You can print out flyers to share with your community on our website. But also, I would say there's a great hotline that NYICLU has created. It's called El Censo. Sorry, it's Agarse Contar. It's 1-800 El Censo, ELCNSO. I was like, I don't remember the numbers. But I think that's it's a 24-hour hotline ran in English and Spanish for any communities who speak those languages and want to access that hotline to ask questions about the census. And the Census Bureau, I think sometimes I would go on their website, not a great portal, horrible user experience, but does have a lot of information, a lot of things that you can download and print out and share with your community. And also, I know that the Census Bureau is right outside, and they have a ton of materials. So if you're interested in getting some, sharing with your office, sharing with your colleagues, asking them how you can get more, and building out relationships with your local census regional offices. And they have partnership specialists that come to events like this to share this type of information. So really use them and take them to your advantage.
Yeah, and let me stick up for the Census Bureau for a second, because I didn't mention them as a trusted messenger. I don't usually spend time talking up the defendants in my cases, but the Census Bureau, the career officials of the Census Bureau, really went to work trying to keep the citizenship question off the census. They put up a lot of really good and persuasive data that Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross gleefully ignored or distorted. But those career scientists really are committed to having a complete and accurate count. I think the folks they work with are generally committed to putting together materials that'll help the public understand what's going on and to try and get people in the door. So do feel free to look on the Census website and any materials. And I think the regional office of the Census here in New York is absolutely something, a resource for all of us.
Fantastic. So really great questions from our audience tonight. I guess in the interest of time, whichever of you feels most comfortable answering the question, it might be great to start there. So the first one is, are group census completion activities a good idea? i.e. halftime at sporting events, church services, conventions, and social club meetings.
Absolutely.
Yes, that's a great
I would say
idea.
100%. Do it in circles where people are already congregated. Just make sure you share out the correct census link. Maybe just text it to the whole group so that they all click on the same link. But absolutely, please do it. Invite me to those sporting events.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we have research from the voting sphere that when people have gatherings at polling places, right, like parties, block parties, that kind of thing, we actually see turnout at those polling places go up 5 to 8%. And so making civic participation into a social activity really increases participation generally, and I think also helps create a habit that keeps people engaged, right? So one of the really wonderful byproducts of census participation is it makes you more likely to register to vote and to do other things that benefit your community.
Does it take a long time to fill out the form? Or?
No, it's 9 questions.
There's a really great phrase that I love to use. It's 10 minutes can affect your next 10 years, and the census can be completed, and I remind everyone, the census can be completed in under 10 minutes, maybe less if you're really fast at clicking, and it's only 9 questions.
You guys are brimming with witty things tonight.
It was a great question. I'm very excited about this.
Thank you to that aspect.
Yeah.
The next question is, why is having citizenship status on the census an issue, especially when we are trying to make sure certain programs are properly funded? Why shouldn't legal citizens paying taxes, income taxes, be taken care of first before illegal immigrants who didn't pitch into the system? This writer adds, don't give me that, quote, to instill fear line, with a smiley face on the back.
Okay. Well, the first thing is everybody pays taxes, right? So lawful permanent residents, undocumented immigrants, everybody pays taxes. So if your rationale is that you should only be filling out the census if you pay taxes, go find the billionaires who managed to find enough loopholes to get out, and let's disenfranchise them. Now, I'm not saying we should do that. Everybody should fill out the census, right? Even the billionaires. We don't tie it, right? Do we disenfranchise children, right? Children don't pay taxes. The little freeloaders. You know, they're going to consume, right? I think the single largest local government expense anywhere in the United States is public education. And it's all consumed by these obnoxious little things that don't pay any taxes.
He hates children.
I know, here I am, fight me on this. So the fact is, it's important to count everybody so that we're providing our services in a way that benefits everybody. And by the way, like, even for people who are maybe not paying taxes, right? And there are certainly citizens who don't pay taxes as much as there are non-citizens who may not pay taxes. And those are, you should all pay your taxes. I try to pay mine. But there are still benefits to allocating resources and political power in a way that respect everybody, because it allows government to run better for all of us. You know, if we know how many people are using the roads here in the Bronx, regardless of whether they're citizens or pay taxes, we will get the funding that we need to ensure that we have, you know, roads that will ensure smooth commerce, and that trucks are able to deliver, supplies to businesses that sell goods and services to our communities. So that's the virtue of counting everybody, is it allows our government to run better for citizens and non-citizens alike.
Fantastic answer. I have nothing to add.
Well, all right. And this might be one for you to start with, because you brought this up. Can you discuss the criminal justice and higher police neighborhood association with undercounted neighborhoods? Sorry to this asker, your handwriting.
Yes. So I don't remember the exact data points, but someone had shared this piece of information with me that I have always taken and really felt to heart, because when we ran down that list of communities that are most undercounted, I actually did forget one that's coming to me now. It's African American males from the ages of 18 to 24. And when you think about communities that are undercounted, and then taking into consideration the things that impact them the most, I think, and this is something that I grew up in Brooklyn, we always talk about criminal justice and over-policing in our community, and really understanding that relationship when police decide or the police force decide to like deploy their forces into the city and which communities should receive more policing, they do look at population data. They do look at quote-unquote crime rates, which is crime over population. I may have oversimplified that math, but you get it.
It's about right.
So if the crime rate, if the population is largely misrepresented, then that crime rate is also disproportionately high. And when they deploy police officers into that community based on crime rates, that community is going to be seeing a lot more police than it needs to be seen, or that community needs, and those police will be active, will be maybe making actions that are incorrect, or making arrests that are maybe not as founded. And that's the impact that's really felt in the community and on the ground by the residents of those communities, simply because of crime rates and understanding the relationship of data. Data is a huge tool. Statistics really inform decisions, and this is across the board, whether it's hospitals, education, police force, etc., roads. So really understanding that data should be one, have integrity, be accurate, and fully represent the people that they're trying to count. And that's the reason why we are always advocating not for an overcount, but for a fair and accurate count of New York State.
I can take a joke about crime rates, but I pretty much covered everything else.
I think people might want to laugh.
Okay.
No?
I was registering voters at Rikers Island, because if you're a pretrial detainee, you don't lose your right to vote, or if you're serving time for a misdemeanor, you don't lose your right to vote. And there's a lot of eligible unregistered voters who've been alienated from the process. So anyway, the joke part is I was talking with one of the Department of Corrections staff about escape attempts, and says, nobody ever swims over there to the Bronx. Everyone would just try to go to Queens instead. And I'm like, I wonder why that is. And then one of the inmates is like, man, have you ever seen the crime rates in the Bronx? So okay, I think that's a lot of fun. It was a lot funnier at the time, but
we can workshop.
I'll work on it.
And this person also asked another great question on the back of their card. Will there be a questionnaire sent in print along with the postcard?
So the Census Bureau has designated certain communities that have been identified as having low broadband or low to no broadband access, and they will receive, instead of a postcard, they will actually receive the full form. After the postcard is sent out, they will send out a reminder, they'll send out another reminder, and if at that point you still have not completed the survey, at the end of April or early May, they will send out a paper form. So there is another option to fill out the census. And then after that form is not completed after 2 weeks, they will then deploy what we call enumerators, which is Census Bureau employees to knock on your doors. So there's a phone option, there's an online option, there's a paper option later in the process, and there's an in-person process that you can take later in the process.
And last question, Facebook announced it would work to suppress disinformation campaigns on its platforms, and we know this has reached beyond the census. Can you talk about that? Who benefits from a disinformation campaign, and who would do it?
I mean, I can't speak on the behalf of Facebook, but I think as a normal consumer of news and information on the internet, as a regular social media user, and having heard news of Russian and other community organized countries, creating fake Facebook groups to share out messages, I would say it's hugely across the board. Everyone benefits from having accurate information.
I'd be a little bit more, so we see disinformation as a voter suppression tactic used all the time, right? And forget about, Russian interference, think right here, there was sometimes you get robocalls going around saying, oh, election day is Wednesday instead of Tuesday in order to get people not to show up. Or you get mailers around saying, people who have arrest records aren't allowed to vote, right? Or, we're worried about voter fraud, so we're gonna have people with guns stationed near polling stations, right? That sort of disinformation is designed to stop people from participating. So the people, promulgating those disinformation campaigns are folks that want to hurt democracy, and sometimes those disinformation campaigns are targeted at particular groups, right? Historically in the United States, disinformation campaigns have been targeted at African-American voters in the South, immigrant voters here in New York City, as naturalized citizen voters here in New York City, Latino voters in the Southwest. But if there are folks who have a vested interest in an undercount, such as an administration that tried to precipitate a differential undercount that would allow them to redistrict in a way that they said benefits non-Hispanic white Republicans and harms major minority groups and Democrats, right? That was on a memo prepared by a Republican redistricting guru who passed away recently. And we only have that because his estranged daughter happened to find those files in a bunch of flash drives that she went and got after he passed away, right? So it's only lucky that we really know the true motives behind all of this, which is to benefit non-Hispanic white Republicans at the detriment of major minority groups. So, the best thing we can do to combat disinformation is to put more and more truthful information out there. I'm glad that Facebook has said it's going to fight disinformation. I would very much like to see them do it in a way that's effective. They haven't done it yet. But all of us should be a trusted messenger. Circulate truthful and accurate information. And if you don't know the answer, help somebody find someone who does know the answer. Sometimes we know the answer, and if we don't know the answer, we're happy to help find someone who does know the answer.
What he said.
Oh, sorry.
What he said.
Wennie, Perry, thank you. I'm so grateful. I learned a lot tonight, just chatting here with you all.
We're delighted to be here. Thank you so much for moderating. Thank you for all for sitting
thank
through
you.
this
Absolutely.
and for braving really awful weather to come here. It's such a delight and a pleasure.
And thank
to be
you
here.
to the folks at Lehman College for all of this. This
Absolutely.
was amazing.
Thank you. Before everyone leaves, I do want to part with one message. It is that 2020 is going to be a major year of civic engagement. Sorry. Beyond the census, I think we all have a vested interest in participating in electoral programs across the year in 2020. We start with an election in April, we have an election in June, we have an election in November. And please make sure that no voice is lost in those elections. In New York State, we do have a closed primary system. So that means if you are not registered to a certain party who's holding a primary, you will not be able to participate in 2 out of those 3 elections, which means really your voice will count 30%, and that's horrible. We should always be heard at 100%. So please make sure that you are communicating and socializing with your immediate family and friends and community that there's elections happening. The deadline to re-register or change your party affiliation is February 14th, Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Please make sure that no one is skipping out on this electoral process because your voice is so important.
The deadline to register is April 3rd. The deadline to change your party enrollment
Yes.
is February 14th. Right, we're currently challenging it in the courts, but there is a 25-day registration deadline. Hopefully there won't be. But just to echo what Wennie said, make sure you're registered to vote at your current address. That if you want to be registered with a party, make sure you're registered with the party you want to be. You're not required to if you don't want to. And vote. Make sure everyone you know votes, and then make sure everyone you don't know votes.
And New York State now has early voting, so ahead of every election, we get 9 extra days. That means 2 weeks, 2 weekends. Go take that sports bar event, and then take them to the polls as well, and then help them fill out the census. Be creative, be civically engaged, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All
Esther.
right.